Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Last night, Theresa May started her push for more grammar schools in England after a civil servant was photographed outside Downing Street with papers proposing the new policy. Talking to Conservative MPs, the Prime Minister said she would not turn the clock back, but she insisted that there is already selection in the system based on the ability of parents to afford the house prices close to good schools. The options are expected to be laid out in a Department for Education Green Paper next week. And Theresa May insisted last night the policy would create a 21st century education system with an element of selection. Among the options being considered is setting up new grammar schools in areas where there is demand for them. Existing grammar schools, such as those in Kent and Greater Manchester, could be expanded. And free schools could be allowed to introduce selection as part of their admissions policy. But the Prime Minister may face a rocky road if she wants to get her plans passed in Parliament, with opposition to grammar schools amongst her own MPs and both Labour and the Liberal Democrats condemning such a move last night. And opponents in the House of Lords will be less inclined to let it pass, as increasing selection in education was not part of the last Conservative election manifesto. Well, earlier, the Education Secretary Justine Greening was called to answer an urgent question on grammar schools in the Commons. And here's what she had to say.
There'll be no return to the simplistic binary choice of the past where schools separate children into winners and losers, successes or failures. This government wants to focus on the future, to build on our success since 2010 and to create a truly 21st century school system. But we want a system that can cater for the talent and the abilities of every single child. So to achieve that, we need a truly diverse range of schools and specialisms.
This policy will not help social mobility, Mr Speaker, but will entrench inequality and disadvantage. It will be the lucky few who can afford the tuition who will get ahead, and the disadvantage that will be left behind. A policy for the few at the expense of the many.
Angela Rayner there. And we're joined now by the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative MPs, Graham Brady, who's a strong supporter of grammar schools. Ed Balls is a former Labour Education Secretary. Graham Brady, what did Theresa May tell you and your colleagues last night?
Well, I'm in the opposition. I never brief on what happens in meetings of the 1922 committee that I'm chairing, but since everybody else has already...
You go ahead.
I think I can confirm,
I think you can.
I can confirm that reports have been quite accurate. And essentially what she said is that there are lots of different types of schools now. We have a very diverse schools sector, something I very strongly support and have always been behind. But it seems very odd that if somebody comes to government with a proposal for a new school which is selective, even though we know that can work and that it's very popular in communities, it is currently illegal to allow it. So dropping that ban, I think, is really the key to opening up an even more diverse sector, and it will raise standards and it will improve social mobility.
Well, we'll test that in a moment. But what does an element of selection actually mean? If we're not going to go back to the binary choice, as Justine Greening said, of grammar schools, where there were successes and failures, as many people saw it, what's an element of selection?
Well, I think the crucial thing in this is that back in the 50s and 60s, what went wrong wasn't the grammar schools. What went wrong was the secondary moderns. And typically they really weren't very good schools.
Right, so you'd actually like to go back to that binary.
I'm saying in an authority like mine, in Trafford, in Greater Manchester, where we have probably the best state education outcomes in the whole country, we have a wholly selective system. But it isn't binary, and it certainly isn't a choice between success and failure. All of the schools in my constituency are outstanding schools.
Right, but you
and
haven't answered the question.
The results are driven by the high schools as well as by the grammar schools.
So what's the element of selection?
Well, an element of selection would be either allowing some new wholly selective schools or allowing some partial selection.
Right, so there would be some new wholly selective schools.
So.
Because partial selection I don't really understand exactly what it means, but it seems to me that you would make a certain number of places on selection, so let's say 30%, and there would be people tutored within an inch of their lives to get into those schools. schools for those small number of places, and the rest would be in a catchment area where people would buy themselves into that catchment area. So in what way is that going to help disadvantaged pupils?
We've already heard the news today that there are now a £2 billion industry tutoring people through their secondary education. So there's something that clearly isn't going right in education at the moment, something that could be done better. Now, there are some very good comprehensive schools and some very good comprehensive areas. There are also things that can be delivered by selective schools.
But why would you want to emulate that system? If you've just said you're criticising the idea that in secondary education people are being tutored to get into the good ones, but you want to emulate that in a selective system.
This industry now is tutoring people throughout their secondary education. That's about standards not being good enough in those schools.
But do you accept that's what would happen? If you had a new school where partial selection was in place, let's say it is in an area where there is a certain amount of social deprivation, you would have 30% of places for which there would be unbelievably stiff competition and everyone would be tutored, and it would only be those who could afford the expensive tuition.
What happens at the moment, as Theresa May said last night, is in many comprehensive areas you've got selection by house price. Can people afford to live in the catchment of the best
But at least
school?
all the places are open to the catchment area.
In selective areas, people can apply for a place, and if they pass the exam, they can get into the school. Now, there is too much tutoring, in my view, far more than when I went to grammar school. But I think that what we can see, if you have more grammar schools, then the competition for those places will be less intense, and there will be less call for that kind of tutoring.
Do you agree with this plan?
I don't. And there are mistakes in politics which you find out afterwards, and there are mistakes in politics you see happening as they're happening. Theresa May is making a big mistake here. There's a really good reason why Graham, who has consistently supported this policy, has been ignored by past Conservative education secretaries and prime ministers going back to Margaret Thatcher, because it's both bad education policy and bad politics.
But they're good schools, aren't they?
Well, the issue is what happens to the children of working class kids and middle class children who get told at 11 you're second best. And hang on a sec, Graham, but what we know from the evidence, because I was an education secretary, is that the grammar schools tend to be disproportionately for more affluent children. But the kids who go to the secondary modern school underperform in those schools relative to other comprehensive schools in other parts of the country because they've been told at 11 they're second best. And you make it much... There are some brilliant secondary modern schools, fabulously led, who do so in really challenging circumstances because they've been told their children are going to underperform. I'm all for setting in schools, but telling kids at 11 you're second best works for the guys who pass the exam and doesn't work for the majority of the kids and parents in your constituency who are told they're second best.
Well, first of all, that simply isn't true. And if you look at the high schools in Trafford, they typically get better results than all ability comprehensive schools.
But what about Ed Balls's point about
the
kids who go to grammar schools?
It is absolutely
It's not true across the country. Kids who go to secondary modern schools underperform relative to children who don't.
Right,
there are a great many secondary modern schools that outperform all ability comprehensive schools.
In very challenging circumstances.
Let's have a look, though, at the opposition. Obviously, opposition from Ed Balls and opposition from Labour, but also there'll be opposition on your own side too, and there always has been, which is why you've struggled to get this back onto the agenda. Now, how are you going to deal with it? Because we've got Sir Michael Wilshaw, the Chief Inspector of Schools watchdog Ofsted, who basically said the notion that the poor stand to benefit from the return of grammar school strikes me as quite palpable tosh and nonsense, and is very clearly refuted by the London experience. And he's talking about state system in London, which does rather well compared to the rest of the country. We also had the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, saying that you are foisting your own evidence-free prejudices on people over possible plans to increase the number of grammar schools. What do you say to that?
Quite the reverse. I think the important thing about this policy is it's not foisting prejudice. It's not telling people what they must do. What we've had for 18 years is a law which says even if a community wants a grammar school, it's not allowed to have it. Now, the opinion poll evidence suggests that 75% of people in this country want more grammar schools. And last year, I think it was Comres polled and said that the supporters of every major political party would like more grammar schools. A majority of Labour Party members and supporters would like to have more grammar schools. Yes, which was
interesting,
and
that was a statistic used earlier this week. It wasn't the majority, actually. I thought it was 45% of Labour supporters, not the majority, but still a higher number than I thought, are interested in the idea of returned grammar schools. The point is, if people want them, and if they're in areas where there aren't any other good schools, or maybe only one other good school, why shouldn't parents be given that choice? Why not let them decide?
The thing you have to decide is what is going to be the best for the most able children and for all children. Of course, it's the case that if you start out thinking your child is going to get to the grammar school and you think that may advantage them, fingers crossed, let's hope that will be great. The problem is it doesn't work out that way. There's a really good column by Simon Jenkins in The Guardian. Simon Jenkins, a Conservative commentator, who said there's a really good reason why Margaret Thatcher, who was probably somebody that Graham revered, didn't expand grammar schools, because she knew in the end that middle-class parents who start out thinking it's a good idea before the 11 plus discover that it's a bad idea when their kids are told they're second best at 11. Now, there are some children who do really well at 7. There are some who kind of really come on when they're 13 or 14. Why should they spend 3 years being told they're second best? Why? How is that good education?
Well, I don't think anybody should tell them they're second best.
They're told that by the 11
No, absolutely not. And if they go to one of the high schools in my constituency...
Yeah, but outside of your constituency, there is a case.
I happen to have the best state education in the country in my
Fine.
constituency.
Well,
but,
good for you.
But we should try to learn from that, surely. We certainly shouldn't ban what
When I
works
was
in one
Education
place.
Secretary, I looked really hard at the experience in Kent and in Gloucestershire, also selective areas, where you had some brilliantly led secondary modern schools doing really good things in very challenging circumstances, but the reality was they didn't manage to deliver the results that were being delivered by, as Joe was saying, the best comprehensives in areas like Hackney and Tower Hamlets, because the hit to expectations and what then happens to teaching as a consequence is something from which these kids never recover.
Right, but it's not being imposed, is it, Ed Balls? That's the difference. You know, the ban was imposed, which is what Graham Brady is objecting to, and others who think like him. This is not imposing a system. This is allowing more choice, and more choice in areas where they do need more schools. Now, the difficulty would be guaranteeing it'll be in areas of social deprivation, and it's always difficult to tailor a system to be perfect. But do you not think it would be a good idea to even look at the option?
So I'm a parent and I'm living in an area where things expand or where it's introduced for the first time, and I don't want my child to be told you're second class at 11 if you fail the test.
You've said that.
Where's my choice?
Right, well, if there are other good schools in the area, which presumably what Graham's saying is the competition would generally improve all the schools. The problem is, Graham Brady, is that the statistics just don't bear out what you say. They may do in your area, but if you look at figures from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, but hang on, let's look at the figures about how many children there are at current grammar schools who are on free school meals.
3%?
3%, 7% in Sutton, 9% in Bexley. That's a very poor proportion, isn't it?
There are so few grammar schools now. Disproportionately, they're in more affluent areas. If we spread them more, certainly if we get them into those more deprived areas, those statistics are going to change.
But do you accept that that's a failure, isn't it? They have not actually allowed social mobility to any great extent. If you're looking at 3, 7 and 9%, those are the statistics.
I think they still do, and I don't think we should get hung up just on free school meals figures. If you look at people on average earnings, there are a lot of people doing really well and getting great opportunities through selective systems. But one of the things that Ed's missing is that everywhere that there is selection at the moment, it is hugely popular. For 18 years, there's been a ballot mechanism in place. People could get rid of it if they didn't like it. Everywhere it exists, people love it because they can see it working.
And the other thing is there is already selection. Graham Brady said at the beginning, people are already tutoring their children, even if they're going through the state system. Or you are buying expensive properties in areas to be in the catchment area to guarantee you a place at the top comprehensive schools. So how is that different?
Well, look, I think you have to be always careful and not take too London-centric a view of these things, because in the large part of the country, people go to the local school and the majority of children go to the local school, and they won't do that anymore if you introduce selection. There's also different ways in which you can solve this house price issue other than going back to the 1950s. Now, there's one approach which is very unpopular, is to do it through lotteries. There's another approach to do it through banded admission, where you make sure that you have a mix of children school by school, which in the area where we live in Hackney works very well, and make sure that you have truly comprehensive schools. Now, of course, in the end, it all comes down to great teaching and great leadership, and you need to have setting to make sure that kids are taught at the right level of ability. But we shouldn't go back to a world where we tell kids at 11 they're second class.
We're going to have to end it there because we've run out of time, but Graham Brady, thank you.
Thank you.
I've been getting